Tango Hotel, this is Tango Bravo. Do you copy, over?
This will be the biggest road protest for quite a long time, and it's making a final stand to finally wake people up to the fact that that roads aren't the solution to traffic problems, and we've got to look at alternatives.
You and the land are one.
Twyford Down became the flashpoint for igniting a national movement against road building.
There was a whole load of alternatives. There was a community campaign, but what was new there was that the tactics of direct action came in with a whole new young generation.
Then from Twyford Down, the focus moved on to the M11 in London.
Very different, very sort of urban, very much about squatting houses and defending houses. Bath Eastern bypass down near Bath at Salisbury Hill. I was at some of the big evictions there, which were really quite frightening. They were just bringing these cherry pickers up and wrenching people out the trees. There was a lot of assaults on protesters. Reclaim the Streets in London, which was very much about bringing life back into the streets and closing streets down so people could use them as a place to live again. And then at the same time as that, there was the huge campaign at Stanworth Valley, up near Lancaster. And also at the other end of the scale, we several times went down to Whatley Quarry, down in the Mendips, to actually shut down Whatley Quarry, because that was where the aggregate came from to build these roads. And at the same time as they were building the roads that were destroying beautiful places, they were digging holes in the Mendip Hills to dig out the aggregate and to destroy the Mendip Hills. So, you know, there was a really big picture. One of the things we were juggling in that period as well was the opposition to the Public Order and Criminal Justice Bill. Suddenly it was like the government had come up with this list of everybody it didn't like and all the things they did that it didn't like, and it was going to make them illegal.
All kinds of people started to come in. It started to coalesce into a bigger movement, which was about our right to be on the land.
What came in with the Criminal Justice Act was aggravated trespass, whereby if you went on someone else's land to stop an otherwise lawful activity, it was a criminal offence, whereas it had never been before. Suddenly it was a lot harder, I think, for people to protest because it suddenly became very illegal.
The tactics that had been developed at Twyford Down were then taken to road building sites around the country. But we all knew then that Newbury was coming. And the Newbury bypass, which was a 9-mile bypass, was really the biggest part of this road building project under the Tory government at that time.
To be fair, the traffic in Newbury town centre was appalling. It was the main route down to the south coast, down to Southampton. So they had these enormous lorries coming through the town centre, and the town was being swamped by traffic. Our point of view, and this has been vindicated with time, was that yes, there's a traffic problem, but building new roads is not the answer. Okay, you're going to get temporary relief to a very palpable and tangible traffic problem, but in the end, you'll have lost 9 miles of countryside.
And I think the road builders knew as well as we did that Newbury was the line in the sand. You know, it was going to be a big one.
It was like Twyford Down. It was one of the most singularly damaging schemes in the whole of the country. So it's a very, very important strategic battle.
And it involved lots of people from lots of different backgrounds, everybody from environmental direct action campaigners who'd come from other campaigns through to local campaigners who were part of the Third Battle of Newbury and lived in the villages around Newbury. There was also interest from the bigger NGOs like Friends of the Earth and Greenpeace who wanted to be part of it.
It seems the Department of Transport, when they thought this one up, thought they'd try just about everything to see how much destruction they could get. Anything of natural interest, natural beauty, or of historic value appears to have been planned into the route of this road.
The sense of grief so many of us felt when Twyford was damaged was unbelievable, and I think I never wanted anywhere to affect me quite the same. And then I remember walking on Skinner's Green at Newbury and just feeling exactly the same thing. It's like, how can they do that to a place like this? It was just such a classic piece of English countryside. You know, rolling fields and hedges and woods and little streams and commons and, you know, just a nice piece of England.
I remember as a kid in Newbury finding little grey crayfish, English crayfish, in the canal. Hawk-moth caterpillars with big furry things with big eyes on them. And it was beautiful. As I say, as a kid we used to play up there. We took a birch bending and making camps and running around. There was lots of trees to climb. It's just a beautiful place.
Every person who was at a road protest would have a different reason for why they were there. For me, the road protest movement was very much about the destruction of land and of habitat and of wilderness, wild areas.
It sounds a bit cheesy, but I really did have a calling. I really just felt that I had to go. I felt that the earth was in pain, generally. I was really starting to feel that. And I just felt like I had to act, I had to do something.
I wasn't turning up at Newbury because I loved trees, because I loved the earth, man, or anything like that. I was turning up because there was something completely wrong with the way society was running.
A lot of people call it, you know, a radical protest, but it can't be radical when you've got no other options. You know, you've tried everything else. You've written to your MP, you've been to all the public meetings, and you've still got no result. This is the last option left.
Instead of putting the money into railways or whatever, they were encouraging the growth of private transport and destroying the land. And a lot of people making a lot of money out of it.
Government reports had shown that if you increase the capacity of road building, the numbers of cars just fills up and increases alongside that. So you end up with the same problem a few years down the line, but even bigger.
It wasn't a couple of miles or a little bypass round a town, it was 9 miles. And that was a big deal. And if you walked that route, which I did many times, it was so peaceful and so beautiful. You wouldn't want anything like that there.
The local people, working with Friends of the Earth, managed to actually stop that road and get it put on hold through a huge amount of public pressure, and the road scheme was put under complete review for a year. The local campaign and Friends of the Earth were working really, really hard. They were preparing a huge study on alternative measures, cheaper, alternative and more sustainable measures that could be put in place. 6 months into the year-long review, on the day that he left office in a cabinet reshuffle, Mawhinney, the Transport Secretary, pulled the plug. He announced the review was over and the bypass was going to go ahead. That was it was gloves off time, basically. The road was going ahead, the government were in no two minds about that.
The first thing we did was to blockade the security guards into where they were staying.
It was down a small country lane, and we waited until the coaches arrived to pick the security guards up in the morning, and then put a tripod up in front and one behind, and that stopped them for the first day.
I am Inspector Nicholson of the Thames Valley Police.
Hip, hip,
I must point out that you may be committing an offence of obstruction of the highway. I will now give you a reasonable time to dismantle your equipment and leave the area. I will point out that if you're still here after that reasonable time, you may be liable to arrest.
If I may say so, a lot of the facts produced by the protesters had been themselves very, very misleading, which unfortunately is one of the reasons a lot of people have been misled into joining this protest, in spite of the fact that the bypass will produce environmental benefits greatly bigger than the environmental disadvantages.
You call environmental benefits trashing 3 sites of special scientific interest, 1 Mesolithic archaeological site, 1 Roman site, a Civil War battlefield. These are irreplaceable parts of our national heritage. Without these, we lose our sense of belonging, our sense of self, our sense of nationhood. What you are doing here is tearing apart the fabric of the nation, which helps us to be whole people, which helps us to be people who feel we have a place. This is a crime which will be remembered for generations.
It was a fantastic way to start the whole Newbury campaign because we went on the offensive. The headline that night was, the Newbury bypassers have won the first battle in the Battle of Newbury, and it was a massive boost.
the road.
Come on, people locks, go. Go for it, just go for it.
Has he got a lock?
No, don't put it pulling on his neck.
A convoy of police vehicles will be coming in here very shortly. Please move behind the police lines for your own safety.
Stop the road! Stop the road!
I'm Inspector Kendall.
Hello,
You are trespassing on land owned by the Ministry of Defence.
Onto the grass verge, please, or you'll be arrested.
And again, work was maybe not stopped the whole day, but certainly delayed, to the point where they'd already lost 2 days of work and we were winning.
This is not a democracy!
This is not something we enjoy doing. It just needs to be done.
Get off me, darling, get off!
We will resist in any way possible peacefully.
Get your fucking hands off me!
We need some help over here.
Get a dog, grab it by his collar, get it out. Won't bite you, just get it. Hold it, hold it.
Months afterwards, people would turn up and they go, "Oh, I saw you on the first day on television and that's why I came, because I thought if she can do it, I can do it." And I remember thinking, oh my God, what have I done?
There were so many people en route. They didn't have the security guards or the equipment or the policing to stop us.
Those first few days were amazing, that work just stopped every day. And then obviously somebody went away and somebody came up with the money, and suddenly there were bus after bus after bus of security guards every day surrounding any area that they were going to work and just keeping people out. And it was a completely different ball game.
I remember there being some kerfuffle about police funding and the government saying there wouldn't be any more because this was just a local issue.
The government couldn't have backed down at that stage. They were always going to throw everything they had at that road, everything they had. That road had to be built.
This one night, these lads appeared, came into Granny Ash camp and said, "Look, we brought up a tripod."
We decided that it would be a really good idea to have that entrance to that big field blocked.
I think Balin's occupation of that tripod, which went on for ages, began as a, I'll do this for a day, and then it became what he was doing and what he became known for, and he was getting publicity and people were coming because they'd seen him in the papers and on television. And
I got up the tripod one day. 3 weeks later, I got down off the tripod. I think I was so beaten on the inside. Well, I was beaten on the outside as well, but I was more beaten on the inside than I was willing to admit to myself.
we established a visitors camp off route that was a kind of safe place where people who'd never done this before were just turning up, and they could get briefings and they could get a meal and they could get a dry place to sleep, and then they could get taken out and get involved in actions, and if they found a camp they wanted to stay on and they stayed, then great.
Different camps worked well for different people. So if you had a particular style, then one camp suited, you had another style, another camp suited. You know, if you liked sitting around singing nice fluffy mandolin songs like I did with Busker Paul, then, you know, that one was for you.
Some camps were really friendly and you could easily go and visit, and some were like, come at your peril.
You'd have the hardcore drinking, cider drinking camps, and then you'd have the hardcore vegan camps.
Skyward Camp, that was incredibly beautiful. There were these massive 80-foot beaches, yeah, there were beaches. Some really nice people. And it was the vegan camp.
It really was like walking into the Ewoks village. There were all these people up in the trees, and you could just see candles being lit and the sound of penny whistles drifting down from the canopy of the woods. It was a very, very steep valley.
Reddings Copse was known as having a very tall pine, which was, I think it was 130 foot tall, The rainbow flag could be seen for miles around, so it was quite a sort of symbol of the whole protest.
OK, so Bob, here we are up the highest bloody tree I've ever been up. Tell us a bit about the tree.
Well, it's a Scotch pine, it's old growth,
155
foot high.
Right.
This tree house is at 140 foot. It's very high, it's very nice, it's a beautiful experience being up there.
My first memories of the chase was arriving in a quagmire, in a swamp.
Sunflower Graham is this guy who came out of the army, and he was a bit older and he was really organised, and he'd done things like rig up some quite sensible and impressive basic camp infrastructure in an army type way. He ran a tight ship. It was good. I liked him.
We had this bender that could sleep 20 people with a wood burner in it, which was very handy because it went down to less than -10 that winter. Bender was a structure that you lived in, mainly made of bent hazel wood and covered with a tarpaulin. The one at the Chase was a raised one on piles. And we had the kitchen and we had a gas burner, so we didn't have to rely on lighting a fire every morning.
Kennet was the closest camp to town, which had some benefits but quite a lot of drawbacks because we had a very transitory population.
It ended up basically being the most easily accessible place for people to stay when they came to Newbury. Quite often I think people would say, oh, go down to Kennet, you could stay in the mothership.
Which had a kitchen in and a communal space and space for lots of people to sleep.
Good afternoon, this is the 3rd Battle of Newbury campaign update. It's Tuesday and the time
It was intense in the office because it was just so busy all the time.
Getting the information out, coordinating transport, because there were very few mobile phones at that point, of course, and no internet.
There was a lot of working out, okay, you know, what are we going to do tomorrow? What are we going to do over the next week? Who's going to do which jobs over the next week? What equipment do we need? Where are we going to get some money from? On the whole, most of the journalists I met were extremely supportive, actually, and really fascinated by what was going on.
And a lot of them became very, very sympathetic to the protesters. You know, they could see how stunning the countryside was. They could see how nasty the other side were. You know, they were seeing the brutal tactics that were being used against people.
Yeah, Tango Bravo, this is Kilo Charlie, over.
Charlie, you can be here for long, can you?
And we had CB radios that were at most camps, and we had a sort of hub in Newbury at the 3rd Battle Office, which would relay information about where contractors' movements were, where contractors were coming from, and looked like they were aiming towards, just to give people a heads up. And we also had almost like a battleship's map with grid references on it.
You know, everybody had a copy of the grid system, as it was very easy to communicate to everybody en route where the clearances or the evictions were happening on that particular day.
In the first 6-7 weeks, what was happening was tree felling, and it was going for the bits that were between camps.
So you'd race to where the security was. If you get there in the first hour, you can always get in. There's always, because they don't know the land, you do. Once you get to the point where they've consolidated their lines, there's not very much you can do. You just stand on the other side of it, and then ever so often someone will fruitlessly run at the lines and get arrested.
Good fun all round, really, isn't it? I've told Mrs. Mitry and won't listen.
You went it this way?
Hi!
already been warned. Are you going to leave the area? No. In that case, you're under arrest. It's Section 68 of the Criminal Justice and Public Order Act for aggravated trespass. You do not have to say anything, but it may harm your defence. You do not mention when questioned something you later rely on in court. Anything you do say may be given...
Big security rings, police everywhere, so if you try to get through the security rings, you immediately get arrested for aggravated trespass.
It just created a whole new law making trespass actually a criminal offence, whereas previously it had been a civil offence.
And very effectively what would then happen is that your bail conditions would be that you couldn't go to the route of the Newbury bypass. They give you a little map and they'd have this ringed area where you weren't allowed to go on. It was called the Newbury Sausage.
My first arrest, I wasn't given any bail conditions. My second arrest, I was given the sausage. And then when I breached that, I was told that I was not allowed to go within the whole of the county of Berkshire. I had to reside permanently at one address and I had to sign on at a local police station at midday every day.
I got a criminal record now because of that, which is, it's not too bad, but every time I go and work in a school I have to prove that I'm safe, and because it says aggravated trespass on my criminal record, which sounds like maybe you went and burgled somewhere and was quite violent when you were trespassing because you were aggravating, or it makes it sound really bad, so I have to go and explain exactly what happened. And
man did not weave the web of life, he is merely a strand in it. Whatever he does to the web, he does to himself.
Polyprop is a type of rope, blue polypropylene rope. It was just sort of a relatively cheap, relatively stable type of rope that wasn't going to snap too easily if there's a few people walking across on it.
It was good to see that it really annoyed the tree surgeon who'd just felled the tree that was very close. And they knew it was close, and they enjoyed the fact that it was close, and they enjoyed the fact that people were fearful.
We'd be sitting in harnesses on the walkways all day long in February, freezing cold. So that was pretty full.
Here's a little history of a bigger mystery. I have written this story into my song. If it isn't what you used to, I hope it will amuse you, and maybe if you choose to, then you'll sing along. It goes, I am as old as the universe. I've been here before and I'll be here again. I am a child of the universe.
And at the end of the day, when everyone had gone, I managed to get down, but I couldn't unbend my legs because I'd frozen solid, and I'd been in this position for 8 hours. All my muscles had frozen, and I had to be carried to the fire where I slowly managed to straighten my legs out.
And you'd get left at the end of the day with sort of 5 trees left and a big patch of clear cut. So those 5 trees would become a camp.
That was why Newbury ended up with so many camps. We realised that their tactic was they were going between the camps, and if we defined an area that was a camp, they had to get an eviction order and they had to have the sheriff there to start getting people out of the trees. Overnight, millions of spurious little camps just grew up, and they all had different names like Rizzler Ridge and Sheep Dip and things like this.
I've been hit in the face, I have been assaulted. It is your job now to arrest him for assault. It has been witnessed by at least a dozen people here, and you are doing nothing.
As the weeks progressed, and they'd cut down more trees and they would just burn them.
and they got bulldozers and they pushed them into massive, great big pyres and set light to them, so like these funeral pyres of the trees. These poor security guards would have to stand in the smoke all day until they got hospitalised.
Think about what you're doing here. You're basically slowly causing life to die on this planet.
All the people and all the commitment, and then going along the route and seeing where everybody was making camps, I thought this is it for me. My life was based around the 9 miles of the site for 3 months.
When I first lived there at the beginning of the protest, it was very grim. It was freezing cold. We didn't have very much equipment, didn't have any money.
Young people turning up, I want to be part of this, I want to come and defend the trees. And they turn up with their little nylon nightmare tent. And, you know, 2-3 nights of -10 and the wood won't light and nothing works and I'm wet and I'm cold. People want to go home. It's fair play. It is stress.
I'd gone from living in middle-class suburbia to living in a treehouse in the middle of a wood in the winter.
But what we could do was say, look, we'll come and stay here. It's warm, it's dry. Don't worry about food. I'll cook you breakfast. And those people then would be taken off by other people, trained out to use the harnesses, trained out to climb.
It was just such a lovely thing to be doing, to be living in the woods with a nice home up in the trees with a load of people of like mind, people who are quite wild and anarchic and prepared to stand for what they believe in, and quite a big mixture of people too from all walks of life.
The stereotype that you get is obviously the kind of young person on the dole, dreadlocks, you know, and head full of new age nonsense and with a bit of conspiracy theories thrown in, and they were there. But there was every kind of people, and from all over, from every kind of background.
You were part of a community, and you didn't even necessarily know all the people there because there's so many of us and so many camps.
When you're in a community forms suddenly like that, you've got this thing that you're doing which is so urgent, you're facing all the eviction and everything. It's really bonding, you know, there's an incredible amount of bonding really quickly.
You're in some fairly extreme situations, and so you're trusting people with, you know, with your liberty a lot, occasionally trusting people with your life. There's so much work to do, and it's such a focus that it seems like every day is going on forever. And so you realise that there's people here that you love as much as you ever loved anyone who you didn't know a fortnight ago. And you don't actually know what the real name is.
Cheers, cookie.
But we had this unspoken agreement. It's like, that is wrong, and we're going to do something about it. And then every time you just get up in the morning and make tea, by virtue of the fact that you're doing it on a roads protest camp, you are doing something about it, because you're physically stopping a bad thing from happening every minute of the day. It's great. Even when actually what you're doing is having a laugh or hanging out in some guy's treehouse.
There are all these amazing guys with dreadlocks, and they're all fit, and at the time I just thought they were all like gods, really. They're like, wow, look at you, you live in your own treehouse. And
Yes, you. I'm talking about your world's going to ruin, grinding to a halt, and it's your fault.
The other thing that used to happen was that people would have a lot of anger. And I think people were arriving with a lot of anger to join in and help, but mostly what they were doing was getting really drunk and expressing their anger to us around our campfires.
I didn't much like hanging around on camps when there wasn't anything happening, because there were quite a few drunk people and some of it could get a bit squalid, and that wasn't what I was there for, you know. But for some people that was, you know, a big part of whatever they were doing in their lives at that time, really.
A lot of evenings we'd just all pile into someone's bender and make some food and get stoned and get drunk on cider and have a laugh, you know. It's a really good crowd of people.
The best, the most priceless incident of all was when the pantomime cow broke through the cordon and lumbered its way aimlessly, randomly towards the chainsaws.
And it was walking around and mooing and going, the grass is greener on the other side, and it was trying to push its way through the security cordon.
And being rugby tackled and arrested and showing the complete humorlessness of the security guards and the police operation. A purely symbolic action, but so powerful.
Actually, when I got arrested, it was in court at the same time as me, and they called it front legs and back legs.
I think it got laughed out of court, really. I mean, it was so ridiculous. I mean, the charge was breaking police lines dressed as the front half of a pantomime cow. I mean, it's...
Yeah, okay, bye. Bye.
So of course the villagers on the edge of Newbury, all the villagers along that route, they were opposed and they lent support.
What you saw at Newbury was a lot of very dedicated people on the ground, but behind them there was a huge network of people supporting them materially, practically, with all sorts of different supplies and resources.
The local ground support was astonishing. Again, it was really significant to these people. This is the woods they played in as kids. This is where they brought their kids. This is where they walked their dogs every day. This meant something to them. This was kind of part of how they felt their home to be.
We also benefited a lot from people from, you know, Reading or Oxford or London. They do a skip run, they come down for the day, they bring loads of stuff, they do loads of stuff and then they go away again. It was great.
This is private land, fine.
This whole area is a matter of civil law rather than anything else.
Yeah.
So we have made very clear to these contractors they cannot move occupied fences. Once you get to the position where there is a possession order and a writ, then that's a matter for the bailiffs.
Absolutely, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. So.
Okay.
Rise, Orion, time to act. Turn to fiction all their fact. Lore is a lie on which they're built. Nothing more than gold and guilt. Rise, Orion, storm and plunder. Now you've got the bastard's number. Act for yourself, be proud and true. Rise to the task which falls on you.
I'm protesting for a badger set, right, that according to the Code of Practice shouldn't have been disturbed.
All I can say is what I know, and what I know is that when the badger set was discovered today, they stopped work.
Work should never have started. These animals are in hibernation.
What I'm saying to you is if you are arrested again today, as you were yesterday, conditions will be put on you that will stop you coming back to this site, which will stop you doing what you're lawfully entitled to do, which is protest.
Right, I don't intend to get arrested again, you know what I mean?
Right, I'll be pleased about that. That's fine.
Yeah?
Yeah.
Yeah, yesterday I went ballistic.
Yeah.
I'll admit that.
I know you.
I lost it at 9 o'clock yesterday morning. It's now 1:15, right? I've been staying quite calm. I'm helping the animals out. I'm doing my job, right? I'm doing my job. Thank you.
The work has stopped.
Have no right.
When you're living in the woods, away from the urban environment and don't have any of that normal stimulation, you start to really, sink into the trees and tune into the trees. I mean, you really do. You start to feel their individual characters.
I lived in an ash tree and it just has a really friendly young vibe. And some of that oak trees, the big oak tree that we had, when I first climbed out, there was this really like, who the fuck are you and what are you doing? Fuck off kind of vibe. I mean, these things could be one's imagination, but also, I don't think so.
I had to overcome a really quite debilitating fear of heights, and I moved into a tree. I moved into an oak tree on the edge of the woods and spent 3 months living in that.
I built everything from like pretty
plush, cosy ones to the most basic, quickest one was like 4 hours, big piece of plyboard, 2 beams, very simple bender structure.
I hadn't had much experience kind of building tree houses and walkways, so I started building benders on Nicky's platforms. So we were making really little, tiny little one-person tree houses because we were trying to get as many tree houses up as possible so we could get as many people living in as many trees as possible.
But I had other tree houses that had like beautiful proper glass window, and barn owls would come and land on the branch and you'd see deer going past. And
it was just beautiful. It was really lovely, peaceful place to be. You know, I think some of my happiest times were just being up in the trees, building walkways and building new tree houses.
I loved my tree. It was a small oak tree, and the tree house was big enough for like one single bed and a tiny little shelf which I kept all my eviction supplies on, just in case, like nuts and things that would last me for a week. You had to prusik up the tree, and prusiking is where you get a climbing rope and you put some special knots on it and you push the knot up and then it holds, and then the next one comes up and you put your foot in it, then you push that one up and pull yourself up, then your foot, and you carry on all the way up. But what I would do is get halfway up and then just sit there and like sway in the wind, and then when I got up to the top I'd be so knackered I'd fall straight to sleep. You had to be careful you didn't turn over in the night or anything or else you'd fall out. Or you wouldn't because you had the tarp over, but it did feel quite sort of scary.
And then you get up and you have your cup of tea, and then you could go across on your walkway and visit your neighbour. You could have a cup of tea with them, a spliff or whatever. And then you can go off on your walkway to see the next person, and you don't even have to come down.
I'd like waking up and just peeping out and crawling out onto my little platform and sitting with my legs hanging off the edge and just being at the same height as the birds, being able to see my friends, have a shout, say, "You coming over for a cup of coffee?" You know, it was great.
Walkways were one piece of rope and another piece of rope, and that's it. So I had my harness, which I was living in. You have to clip your harness to the top rope and walk along, and it's like this.
If you were on a walkway or a rope and you were hanging on it, they couldn't cut that tree down or that tree down because you were on the rope in between, and your life would be threatened.
I was up in a tree in Penwood, and it was a really, really cold day, but it was also really sunny and really beautiful, and the birds are singing and the sun is shining, and I'm just really, really glad to be alive. And I sit up in the tree and I'm like, I want to sing like the birds. What am I going to sing? And I realised that the only song that I know is Bohemian Rhapsody. So I sit up in the top of this tree and I sing Bohemian Rhapsody like there's no tomorrow.
We had a communal treehouse called the Good Ship Venus. We had this stupid party up there one night and everyone just got really trolleyed, and then we thought, let's see how strong the binding is. And everyone started jumping up and down at the same time. Here we are, 60, 70 feet up in a tree, and everyone's jumping up and down on the floorboards to see how strong the tree house is. And it's, you know, all our tree houses were held up with polyprop and charm.
It's quite interesting that of all the people here, the majority are against this road.
We are sick and tired of being quiet. We have been quiet for far too long. Look where it's got us. We have got to start making a noise.
Mr. Young, stop the bypass! Stop the Newbury bypass! Nowhere to run, nowhere to hide.
Seriously?
Young, let us buy you a stiff drink.
Stop the road. We've had enough of our trees being destroyed with meaningless short-term solutions.
We love the forest.
Asthma increasing at 10% a year.
Exactly. Stop the bypass, you fool! We love you, but we don't love your road!
Stop the road! Stop the road!
Need a job to feed my On a particular day, I went around the cordon with my guitar, because I'm a musician, and I just started singing, "What are we doing here? What are we doing here?" over and over and over again, because I couldn't think of anything else to say. So I said, well, you come up with some lyrics, come on, we've been here day after day after day, you write something. And then the security guard said, I'll write some lyrics. And then I added in a couple of lines about their job and how much it cost, how much they were working for and what the conditions were, and that made them laugh. They employed 800 security guards in the end, and every day 800 security guards would come, cordon off the area they were going to cut, and act as a private police force.
It was a real kind of story of contrast, really, because we were living in a certain way, being in the woods, and they were all in these aircraft hangars, and there were stories coming out of what it was like for them and the conditions they were having to deal with. And
so most of them were kind of didn't know why they were there either. Been sent out by magistrates, a lot of them had told us, join the security guards down at Newbury, or you're going to spend some time in some institution, and they were given a choice. A few of them I'd spoken to, so that's the only reason they were there.
Julian Cope picked me up one day when I was hitching. He was in a Range Rover with loads of shopping bags full of tobacco and oranges.
He came down a lot. They were down several times a week. Come to a camp and just like take you into town, do a food shop and pick up the tab. They were brilliant. And he got to present Top of the Pops.
Tonight, we're clearly out of our trees. Is the Lighthouse family lifted?
Changed his T-shirt between each thing, so it's got, a bypass is not the solution. And he's like, yeah, and here's TerrorVision. We're wearing that.
Bless you, TerrorVision. Here's the top 10.
And in fact, it got a huge number of complaints. It got more complaints than any other edition of Top of the Pops ever, including that one with Cameo where the guy had the massive red cod piece. We got more complaints than that.
Friends of the Earth are absolutely crucial in the building up of the Newbury Bypass campaign, and people find it very easy to slag them off, but actually the campaign would not have been anywhere near as big without their involvement. They really mobilised all their supporters, and Friends of the Earth were really, really great at doing the media. We were headline news on the television and in the newspapers constantly. It was being debated up and down the country. Newbury became a byword for environmental destruction, environmental vandalism, and that was down to the huge amount of work that Friends of the Earth put into it.
This is the largest anti-roads protest gathering that there's ever been in this country. There are over 5,000 people already who have turned up, and we can still see them coming down in their hundreds. We all know that it's not going to work, and the government's own traffic figures yesterday have confirmed that within 5 years the congestion problems in Newbury would be as bad as they are today.
You guys deserve medals. Please don't mind.
We don't need medals. We're just people who are just acting out of conscience, out of our love for this land. Like you said, we don't need medals.
I can understand that. Now you guys are carrying on that struggle. Bloody marvellous. I wished I was young again. I'd be there. I would.
Good man. Thank you.
I'm allowed to go to the cabs, you're not allowed in, mate.
There was a detective agency from Southampton called Braze who'd been hired, and they had, their own coloured hard hats. I think they were the green hats. Big long lens cameras, and were just at everything. Very little of their stuff turned up in court cases, which is interesting, because that means, well, what were they gathering this for?
Do any of the photographs get sent to the police at all? Do they go on file?
I wouldn't know.
So who is it you work for? Is it Braze Detective, Fireways Agency?
What's known now is, there are several different spy units that have existed since 1958 to deal with exactly this form of protest. This is the people who are active politically but aren't bomb planters. That zone there, but you're actually going to take action on politics that's outside of the spectrum represented in the House of Commons, and that's basically what they mean by domestic extremists.
A message had come over on the radio as to where the evictions were happening, and so we all jump into the only car left and rush out towards Emborn Road. And we arrive at this scene of the sun coming up on this beautiful English landscape dotted with huge oak trees and wonderful vistas, really awesome to look at, and then just surrounded by an army of neon-clad security guards in the middle of this idyllic English dawn scene, and no protesters. There was hardly anyone there. Literally 4 or 5 of us turned up and saw this and realised we were helpless. There was nothing we could do, so we just started filming. And at that point, a big bunch of the security all started to run off towards these 2 huge oak trees on the other side of the field. Huge trees, they're 200-300 years old at least. Monsters, massive. And the guys start climbing up into the trees and start chopping limbs off. As soon as it started, there was a feeling, a tangible feeling in the air. Something bad was happening. You could feel it. Like being at an execution. This thing stood there for 300 years and you're killing it in a matter of minutes. And just at that moment, out of the corner of my eye, literally coming out of the mist, these 2 scraggly black horses covered in mud start running towards this scene of devastation, where there's chainsaws going, there's hundreds of security in big yellow jackets, there's a load of noise. I picked the camera up and started rolling, And not only did they run at the security, they ran through the security lines. The security were trying to wave them away and banging and clapping. And eventually they sort of burst through, ran round the back to the stumps, basically, of where these oaks had just been felled. The feeling in the air was thick. There was something different happening here. It was a really strange moment. And this black horse covered in mud runs straight up to the police horse and just puts his head, 2 foreheads, straight together. And a second later, the pair of them just rear up in a kind of an aggressive standoff. And at that moment, everyone was just dead quiet, like what is going on? They kept running around and trying to disturb the process, and then as quickly as they appeared, they just disappeared and were gone. They're huge, these trees. You only see how huge they are when they're on the ground. When they're up in the air, you can't really fathom it. But when you see them laid out and it takes you 10 minutes to walk around it, and you look at all the branches and how huge and intricate it is and how long it's stood there for and all the life within it, and to see it just chopped, devastating.
Excuse me, can you clear the pathway, please, for this machinery? Otherwise you'll injure yourself. Excuse me, can you clear the pathway, please?
So yeah, we had this sort of dialogue going on with the police for a while called Operation Prospect, whereby they would actually, they were trying to do some kind of transparent policing where they were telling us what they were going to do and what their strategy was. And after about 6-7 weeks, the police suddenly stopped talking to us. It was obvious that why that happened was because the evictions were going to start.
Prior to the work starting, I think there were about 7 camps. And then when work started, more and more camps sprung up. I think there were over 30 in the end.
They obviously moved on from clearing between the camps to coming for the camps themselves.
There was a real drive to get the evictions done before the end of March, because tree felling couldn't go on after the end of March because of the bird nesting season. And so it just ended up with, a 4 or 5 week period when every day was at least one eviction. It was just eviction after eviction after eviction.
It was intense because you never knew which camp they were going to try and evict. And it got quite surreal.
You could be a few miles away down the road and you'd have no idea that anything so colossal was happening. But then once you were within it, it was like this sort of insurrection zone in which anything could happen.
and all the normal rules just seem to go out of the window. And the eviction process requires the sheriff or the under-sheriff of the county to be there and to read out this eviction order that, you know, you are going to be evicted, and if you disobey the sheriff it's an offence and all this sort of thing.
Or any of my bailiffs, you may be liable to arrest.
That was the point at which they could start pulling people out of trees and they could start dismantling tree houses.
Where's Brian?
The eviction of Snelsmore Common took 2 days. The warning call went out at dawn. I remember waking up with this shot of adrenaline and, oh my God, this is it. Been waiting all these months and suddenly it's here.
The Snelsmore eviction was an interesting one because it was their first real go at getting people down out of the trees.
And Snelsmore had the first tunnels, and tunnels are very, very defendable because you build them like a hippie and they won't go down them until they're safe enough for health and safety, because if you've got tunnel going underneath the ground you can't bring heavy plant machinery in like cherry pickers.
It was just awful because they evicted the tunnel in minutes. There was just one poor young chap in there, but the rumour was that he was told that they would send a police dog down and that the police dog would be set on him if he didn't get out.
Weeks and weeks of work had gone into building this tunnel and it had been nabbed basically in next to no time, and it was just like, oh fuck.
This is not Highways Agency land! Everybody's getting killed in this! I think keep the peace was the idea, wasn't it? Careful! Steady! Thank you. Leave mine out. Thank you.
I didn't know how to climb, and my first eviction was absolutely very scary. No harness, and by the end of the first day, being chased around the trees by bailiffs, I was really quite proficient.
This is undemocratic! This is dictatorial! This is a bulldozer of state!
I was assaulted 3 times by an officer on the ground while I was peacefully lying on the ground doing absolutely nothing.
Lift your head up, please, for
I'm a
identification.
peaceful protester. I'm trying to protect the countryside, and I don't see why I should comply with fucking violent policemen who assault me while I'm on the ground. It's supposed to be a free country and I have a right to stay in my home.
What people forget about protesting, and even during an eviction, there's an awful lot of hanging around and not very much happening. I'm a songwriter, I play the mandolin, so very transportable instrument, so I could go along and sing songs, and there were various protest songs that got written, rabble-rousing songs.
I've shared many moments and I've made many friends. So if you are my enemy, let's try to make amends.
You're wasting this country. For what? For no future. No future for your children. You'll have to answer to them. You are suffering from transient global amnesia. Wake up! Wake up! I am no one's master. On my grave, they will write this after I am
damn dirty, they should look up in the Oxford Dictionary what anarchy means. Individual freedom of thought, which has nothing to do with robbing people.
It is a love. It is a love that brings you the invitation. Join me now in my invocation. Father, I rescue the innocent. Jesus, I deserve to be blessed. Now I know just how much I depend on you for life. You are my life. You are the life that grows in the flesh I'm weaving, life that grows in the air I'm breathing. I am strong as a tree.
And the last thing I'll say is the real state secret is not defence or security, but the misery of everyday life.
And they evicted us all day and decided for the first and only time to put lights up and try and keep an all-night cordon.
And whereas day one had been full-on battle and the blood was up, day two, I think the fight was out of people. And I know some people at Skywood Camp put up an extraordinary fight.
Inspection, get everything ship shape and shine. Check one. Hot shot, boom shot, all kind of shot. We don't take that back. What you doing here? No, youth and youth. Remember, we don't talk foolishness, we talk truth. Long time without them, we come forth now. You think we did done, you think we did whole. Well, you know. Going out to all the wretched souls. Come again.
Individuals, flood the basket!
Turn up, 6 o'clock. You don't sort your cherry pickers out till 2. And what have you taken out? 6 people? 6 heroes?
The amount of heroic swashbuckling stuff going on at such height and altitude, it was quite amazing that no one was more badly hurt, really.
That was a day of extraordinary emotion. It was very upsetting and a lot of incredible acts of bravery in the trees. I remember after my tree had been cut down, watching, I think it was a robin flying around, and its sense of geography had been completely screwed by the fact that the trees had been cut down.
Pound Street could well be Kennet. Everybody down to Kennet ASAP. Is that a confirmed?
Which way? No, it's not confirmed until they get there. What you reckon?
Right, okay.
Every day, the security guards would get up and they would go to the location where the trees were going to be cut down. And some days it was my job to try and work that out, track them, figure out which camp they were going to, and let as many people know as possible.
Hey! Aim it away! Convoy!
Sometimes you had to guess, it's like, which way will they go further along the road? Which camp is it? So that camp would be like, get ready for an eviction, and everyone else trying to rush there.
Yeah, good morning, Granny Ash. Welcome to your eviction day.
I looked back across the field and I noticed a flood of yellow flashing lights and blue flashing lights coming down the A4.
Pack A couple of trees, yeah? They're coming up already.
Just after dawn, stuck my head out and the A4 was just lined with vehicles. It's just a sense of hyper-reality. You just go with it, really.
I'm warning you that if you continue to use this PA system that you've got, you are committing an offence under Section 10 of the Criminal Law Act in relation to obstructing a court officer, i.e. the High Sheriff. You're preventing him from talking to people. All right, when you're over talking him. Okay, so I'm just warning you.
Is that the best you can come up with?
It is at the moment.
You will be physically moved if you do not move aside now. Do you understand?
We're a bit deaf.
If necessary, arrests will also be made.
I'll choose a little patch. I'll point to 3 people. If they don't move, we've got 3 pairs to deal with it. All right?
That's a really good tactic, nice one.
You're committing the offence of aggravated trespass at the moment.
Leg, really leg.
Welcome to the Department of Transport's second unsafe eviction.
I've heard the phrase hands the size of shovels before, but never seen it until I met Balin. A gentle giant, and one of the kindest people I know. But he knew how big he was, and he intended to use all of his strength. We were in a non-violent, peaceful protest, and we did what we could to make sure no one got hurt.
Hitting someone over the head with a shield is not reasonable force!
There was a bit where they started bashing Julian with a riot shield. I had to run over and try and get in the way of it because that's not right.
You're risking lives, Sheriff!
The little bit where they tried to pull my face off, almost broke my arm, and then eventually dropped me through the trapdoor of the treehouse was a little bit confusing because, you know, I thought they'd had me, I thought that was it. And then they let me go again. And I ended up going up and down a limb at the far side of the tree a few times until eventually I overbalanced and I was getting so weak. I put a foot on the cherry picker, so what looks like me gently and everything stepping across wasn't a choice. I ended up holding onto the outside of the cherry picker as best as I could onto the safety rail of the outside of the cherry picker with my feet on the bottom safety rail. The 2 gentlemen inside were kicking me repetitively in the shins to the point where they stripped my shins of their skin and the blood was pouring over my feet when I got to the ground. While it couldn't be seen because of the way I was hunched over and they were hunched over me, were punching me in the face repetitively all the way to the ground.
You can take your photograph. No, I wish you to arrest me here and now for carrying an offensive weapon.
He's our Lord High Pen Dragon. You can't, no way. You can't take Excalibur. You're not King Arthur.
Face it, ground.
Eventually they removed everybody from the line of trees where Granny Ash stood.
It took 5 hours for them to get 7 people out of 3 trees. That 5 hours was probably the craziest time of my life. I've existed now for 44 years. I've lived for about 15 minutes. And most of that 15 minutes was up those trees in that time.
was woken up by shouting. You go from being asleep to terrified in a matter of seconds.
I looked out the window and they were already climbing up my tree. They couldn't get a harness around me, so what they did is they lowered me upside down by my ankle out of the tree. I couldn't even speak, I was so upset and I couldn't breathe, and I think the police saw how distressed I was, and instead of arresting me they put me in an ambulance. When I got to the hospital I'd calmed down a bit, and the nurse in there looked at me and she said, "You people like you don't deserve medical attention." And that upset me so much. I ran out of the hospital and I collapsed on the pavement and just cried my eyes out.
See, they had to get everybody out before they could start cutting the trees, so it was a real victory. Each person they had to bring out. At the end, there was this one person, one lone figure right at the top of this tree, and they were cutting the branches off the side of the tree.
And he climbed up the tree and I thought, okay, this is me, I'm going down. And he got to just a little way below me and he just looked up and he looked right into my face and he said, "I'm going to leave you there till morning." And then he climbed down again and cut all the branches off after him. So I couldn't have got down if I wanted to. And then they did come, they came in the cherry picker. I climbed up higher, so my feet were where my head had been. I couldn't really feel my fingers that much. So they tied me to the tree, and then they just snapped it. The police cautioned me, and then I was immediately handed over to my friends, who gave me some tea and some cake.
Shame! 27 camps to go then.
If you're the one who's throwing them out, you're the one who's
I did tell you that I wasn't sure that it was done upright and you didn't check it.
So during the eviction phase of the protests at Newbury, one of the main things that made the government's forces very, very capable of doing the evictions, actually in often quite a safe way, was having very experienced climbers.
These climbers have been called scabs by the climbing community, which is fair enough. Because for a climber to be involved in destroying the natural habitat is not acceptable. A climber is someone who gets out and appreciates the natural habitat. So it wasn't acceptable, and we all knew it was just for money.
We're in a tree being evicted and there's a climber coming up who's just down there. Why are you doing up a tree then?
For money.
Nothing to climbing for the money.
Yeah.
That's worthwhile.
Well, that's it, I'm afraid. Tightening this handcuff very tightly in an effort.
And they did end up being entirely ostracised, and they were sort of slow hand clapped at a meeting of the British Mountaineering Club, and they were told not to go to particular climbing walls because they were no longer welcome and things like that. Yeah, so they got quite a hard time.
Doesn't it bother you, the lack of health and safety regulations practised here? Aren't you actually concerned about what might happen to you?
Can you move away, please? You're obstructing this gentleman from doing his work, and move away, or you will be arrested.
The UK climbing community really got on side with the protesters, and there was quite a lot of equipment came to us from the UK climbing community and climbing shops that would give us discounts and send stuff to us, which was brilliant.
It led to this quite interesting standoff where some of the best climbers in the world came and joined the protest, running rings around these other climbers,
That was amazing. That was like watching some swashbuckling pirate film, you know, with guys just swinging around and just doing unfeasible things.
There were some very sound police because most of them didn't agree with what was going on there.
They've pulled you down out of the tree and you're all right, off you go. Just trying to get nicked again today. No, that sort of, there was a lot of that, a lot of humanity amongst the police especially.
I lost count of the amount of times I got arrested. Quite a big rap sheet. There was obstruction of a public highway, obstruction of a private highway, obstruction of a police officer twice, a fray, aggravated trespass, and obstruction of the sheriff.
The first time I was arrested, it was all quite jolly. There must have been 6 other women in the cell and we were just singing and getting to know each other.
I was in a shared cell with like 6 other women, some of whom were in for drug smuggling and murder, but they were, you know, we had a right old crack really. They thought I was pretty bonkers. You know, I didn't have a nightie, I had a stick instead of a toothbrush. You know, I really had like come straight from the woods.
We are in a privileged position that we can take direct action like that and not get killed or disappeared as a result of it. Because Kennet was a very particular location between the canal and the river, they weren't going to be able to get cherry pickers in to get people out of the trees. Kennet Camp was purposefully flooded by the protesters, you know, to make it more difficult to evict. It made living there extremely difficult when everything's under like a foot or 2 of water. You don't want to miss your own camp's eviction. You know, you spent months of your time creating the defences there. You're extremely attached to your tree house, your trees, the people that you're camped with. And it had been one of the longest standing camps, so there was an awful lot of defences and walkways, and we had a whole network of metal walkways that weren't easy to cut. And it must have been about 3 or something in the morning that a good friend of mine was shouting that there were men in black just outside his tree house, and when it did come alight, all the metal walkways had gone.
Good morning, Kennet Camp!
And so the climbers came up the tree house that I was in. It had a lock on in it. And so the climbers decided they were going to lower the lock on one rope and me on another rope. And at that point I just became extremely scared then that they were going to get it wrong and then drop the concrete barrel, you know, with it still attached to my arm.
She said that the only way she got through it was because everyone was just saying her name over and over and over again.
It was all right, and then at the bottom of the tree just got surrounded by really nasty bailiffs to get the lock on it. I think everybody else had already been taken off to the police station, so I think I was on my own. I was certainly on my own in the cell, which the previous time I'd been arrested, I was with a whole massive bunch of people and it was kind of fun. But this time I was, I guess, traumatised. It's funny, it never quite goes away.
That's what we're getting evicted from. This is what they're blocking us from getting in. There's been no papers served.
Section 10 of the Criminal Law Act 1977.
Well, you've left the corn, so you're all right now.
Okay.
All right, just don't enter this corn.
All right. All right. I'll remember that.
Don't do it again.
We were making it up as we went along, and we didn't know what we were doing, so they couldn't second guess us. Like, how can they work out what we're doing when we don't know what it is ourselves? That's the strength of roads protesting.
That is a lovely bracelet.
If you're on a walkway between 2 trees, then
you're actually protecting 2 trees at once. Now I'd set up a steel cable so they couldn't just chop through it with a knife.
And I can't remember if it was that day or it was the next day that Nicky nearly died. He was on the walkway, but I think he had his hands on the steel cable, I'm not sure. Or he was on the steel... Anyway, they cut the walkway and he fell.
And I looked across at the guy at the other tree, and he looked at me, and I thought, well, he can see that this is cable supporting me, and he can't cut it. And he got the bolt cutters and he chopped it. After I'd fallen about, I don't know, maybe 10 foot. So I'd built up a bit of momentum, grabbed on this branch, it bent all the way down and I thought, is it going to snap? And it didn't.
That was full on and caused a lot of mayhem, and people started throwing things and shouting stuff, and I think that was near the end of the day, and I think they kind of stopped.
It was like they'd stuck a flipping stick in a hornet's nest, and they had to give up for the day. Everyone was so angry, they just had to go.
I remember being immensely proud after the eviction of Manix Jar, because we had a real reputation as really fluffy camp. We were like, sit around playing music and all this. But we kept them off 2 days on this tiny camp.
We had 8 oak trees, one the huge pine. It was like a 200-foot pine, biggest tree on the route, with the ladder out the top and the flag on the top of that.
The story was that there was no cherry picker big enough in Britain to go to the top of this tree, so they'd imported one from Scandinavia.
Everybody!
And the first thing they did, the bailiffs, was go up in the box to the top of the tree, take the flag, and then go down doing a little, waggling their arses like kids, you know. I just remember in one moment in a break just thinking, okay, Mother Earth, you know, we're here doing our bit. If you really have a mind and energy, then help us. And the next moment, there was an almighty crack.
And they sort of taken out about 6 of the oak trees, and then one of them they felled, and it actually spun in a weird way and didn't fall the way they wanted it, and fell on their 225-foot cherry picker. You know, apparently it was the only one in Europe or something.
One of its branches had gone straight into the control panel on the side of the giant cherry picker.
The group of climbers, they had to run, and the tree came down like that, and they were all running. But one of them got completely caught in the top branches, and he actually took a branch on the head. I think he had a helmet on.
It was really scary because, you know, we actually thought he was very badly injured. In the end, he wasn't.
Sheriff Blandy was just carried on eating his sandwich. It was a bizarre reaction to seeing one of your guys all possibly getting killed.
That was it. That machine was out of action, and they gradually all packed up and went home. And we were up the tree for another day.
It was pretty obvious by then that it was going to be the Rickety Bridge eviction next.
Rickety Bridge, which was down on Speedham Moor, was one of the last main evictions, and a lot of people had gone on there after being evicted from other camps. So that was a massive eviction taking place, and that took the best part of a week.
The sun was just coming up and it was by the river and it was really dark and misty, and the first thing you saw were these sort of the black outlines of the police and then these very sort of shimmery high-vis jackets from the security guards.
Can you move over there, please? Can you get off the bank, please? Can you please get off the bank?
And they had a sound system in the trees, and they were playing I Shot the Sheriff.
It was just this sort of barrage of foghorns and noise and smoke grenades.
Rickety Bridge was on an island. The night before, contractors came and built a bridge out of railway sleepers so they could drive cherry pickers and bulldozers over onto the island the next day to start the eviction. So as soon as the bills had gone, there were protesters there trying to hack it up with chainsaws and burn it and get rid of the bridge.
And I remember being in this ash tree and I saw 2 tree creepers going up this tree, and they go around the tree in a spiral, and just being so gutted that that tree wasn't going to be there by the end of the next couple of days. And these birds just came right past me, and you know, just feeling that that was like the last time that this really old woodland was ever going to have that kind of life in it.
They evicted us in the end. It took them a long time, several days, and I think it was probably the hardest area for them to evict.
I got evicted at Camelot, which was a camp that had been set up by Arthur and his knights. And Arthur is a druid, self-proclaimed king, reborn from the times of Arthur. He's got a load of friends who are his knights, who also believe themselves to be reincarnations of the Knights of the Round Table. When I did finally get dragged out of a tree, it was just totally the opposite experience of what I'd been dreading all these months. Really, I just found the whole experience quite hilarious. I'd climbed up this tree, I'd got my head de-locked with a bike lock to the tree like this. They cut it off and they started to send me down a rope, send me down the tree. And then the policeman said, "You're nicked." I really couldn't believe that policeman actually said that. You know, I'd never been arrested before, and I'm trying to get the policeman to sing songs with me, and I'm dancing along, and you know, we've got my arrest photograph of me and the policeman having a big hug, and far from being intimidating and scary, it was actually a really empowering experience.
We only had 2 trees, but we had lots of lock-ons. By then they knew this, and they had 2 or 3 teams of Land Rover lock-on cracking units with angle grinders and cutting gear and all of that kind of thing to get through concrete. And even though they got to us by lunchtime, they'd already done 5 camps that morning.
Get off there, don't do that! sake! No, I don't even know. He's locked on, for God's sake.
That tree, it didn't have any branches left on it, just the two at the top like this. And we had a steel walkway that went off route into the woods. We were able to just basically ferry about half a dozen people overhand like that across into the tree. The bailiffs came up to us in a cherry picker. They looked up at us. They said, "All right, lads, you coming down?" We said no, and with that we took our harnesses off and put them in our pockets. And we just stood holding these little branches like that. It was really stupid. We're at 80 foot basically, and I just sort of stepped over to the basket, and with that the branch that I'd been holding on to just snapped in my hand, and they just looked at me like, "You total idiot." And I was like, well, you know.
What's your name? Straight to the sheriff and proud of it!
They took me out first and they took Adam out. I had a real struggle cutting the tree down. It was really funny. They'd sort of cut right through it and I had wedges in. They were just sledging and sledging. The tree just stood there and stood there and stood there, even though it wasn't even connected. It was amazing.
Just to let you know, security are now moving out of Tot Hill, over.
The final tree had come down and the security guards cheered at it. Then chainsaw workers started slicing just little cross sections off as trophies for people.
Blandy had this press conference to try and use what happened to Middle Oak as a PR thing to say that although they'd built this, massive piece of infrastructure, they were being as sensitive as possible to the environment. And a crowd of people turned up and just kind of charged him out of there, basically. He got in a Land Rover and it was a sort of Benny Hill incident of him driving across the field with this kind of mob of protesters coming after him and the, cameras filming it.
Come back another day, Mr. Blandy.
So yeah, a very bizarre ending to an incredible 3 months and a few years.
Yeah, there were 10,000 trees on the route and 4 got a reprieve, and there's Middle Oak. And there's 3 at Mary Hare that are still there today, and will outlive us all.
And they built the road and all that, fine. But we fucking made it hard. 3 months it took them to just clear the way, and then people were still doing actions afterwards.
It was the most successful direct action campaign there's ever been in Britain because it overturned the government policy.
And the roads budget got slashed, by 2/3 overnight. £17 billion saved.
And effectively the road building programme, I think at that point, was dead because there was no popular support for it anymore.
We reversed the British road building programme. It worked, what we did.
I stayed at Newbury for some time, actually. I was one of the last of the protesters to leave. And we carried on doing all kinds of crazy actions for many, many months.
We kept harassing them while they were trying to build the road, cutting fences, just destroying anything they built that we could. But it got to a point when, they're laying tarmac, there's not a lot you can do.
I'd sort of walk up and down the off-route camps that had sprung up, but sort of just trying to make sense of it. It's like, how do you make sense of it? I've been here best part of 2 years and I left. And didn't go back for another 10 years.
Over 200 roads have been dropped over the last 2 budgets, and that's because of campaigners like you. The future is about bicycles and buses, trains and trams. That's what creates jobs. That's what creates healthy communities.
I believe the Newbury campaign has been an absolutely brilliant campaign that will be remembered for many years, indeed many centuries.
Tony Benn gave a speech, didn't he? And I remember thinking that it was quite moving, but at the same time just feeling this general feeling of absolute frustration that there was this terrible, hideous desecration next to us, and all we were doing was making nice little speeches and hanging a few ribbons, and it all felt a bit impotent and pathetic. So I was really pleased when somebody suddenly brushed alongside me and put a pair of secateurs in my hand and I instantly knew what they were for. Quickly people had just snipped big holes in the fence and people were starting to climb through.
What they hadn't taken into account was that a lot of people had come back from all over the country who were very, very angry and very upset and very hurt by everything that had happened. I mean, you know, my eviction experiences and the assaults that I was subjected to, that's common, that's what happened to everybody. And I think we were all pretty pissed off by then.
There were large earth-moving trucks, these ones with the massive tyres, and suddenly one of them caught alight. Somebody climbed the arm of the crane and was up there with a fire stick. Then the porter cabins caught alight.
Whatever the rights and wrongs, and people argue about it, about damaging property and machinery, it was beautiful to watch. It was a moment of catharsis and deeply powerful.
Where are we? Fuck knows anymore. The land's changed so much.
Some efforts, and as you've said, millions of pounds worth of security. The road has been completed. Very low-key opening last night. The Highways Agency wanted very little publicity. Today, Newbury, for the moment at least, is more or less traffic-free. So is this...
It was a deeply powerful and life-changing event, and I know I'm not alone in thinking that my life was completely transformed and made meaningful in ways I'm still comprehending, actually.
It's a sort of one-way door, really. Once you've gone through that experience, your life has changed for good, and I think for the better as well.
People who've been through that and come out the other end, the feeling of empowerment, never be the same again, never be the same again. Very brave, unbelievably and undeniably brave young people.
And on the occasions when I have driven up the A34 through Newbury and I've looked up, and I've just thought, God, all the things that happened in the airspace above the road. You know, laughs had, cries had, orgasms had, children conceived, fights, near misses with death.
Most people think we don't need more roads. Most people think we need better infrastructure and better train services and cheap trains and free trains and better buses and better fuel and different fuel. You know, we all think the same mostly. Mostly people want good solutions that work for people.
Some civil servant sitting around the desk saying, we don't want another Newbury. Do you know how much that cost? You know, I'm sure they still say that. So yeah, we can be proud.
Those places were lost. You know, and that's a tragedy. It's a kind of national tragedy. That landscape has been marred forever, and it never should have happened.
Where are we all going? Does anyone know?
It really feels like you're doing something with your life that's worthwhile, that you can look back on and think, yeah, I stood up and said, this is wrong. And I believe that we will be vindicated in the future. And if you're interested in this sort of thing, and if you feel that it's wrong, then anybody, you should really come down here now, because this is when it matters at this point, rather than in the future or in the past. It's now.